My mother had asked me years before she passed away, when she was in hospice, she said, Saul, whatever you do, do not lose my daddy's land. And I've made a commitment to not lose this land.
That was Saul Blair. He's devoted years of his life to reclaiming family land purchased by his great-grandfather in the years after slavery. But the retired healthcare executive in Georgia has hit roadblocks as he works to hold on to the land. And his story is putting a spotlight on heirs' property rights. Over the course of the 20th century, Black Americans lost around 80% of the property they owned at the peak of ownership in the years following the Civil War because of theft and systemic injustices. Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson. For more about Saul's story and some of these broader issues it highlights, I'm now joined by USA Today reporter Andrea Riquier. Thank you so much for joining me, Andrea.
Hey, Taylor. Thanks for having me.
So just starting here, would you tell us a bit about Saul Blair and his family story?
So Saul actually lives in the Phoenix area. He is the great-grandson of somebody named John Thomas Jr., who was born into slavery in sort of central Georgia, 1859. Somehow, and we don't know right now how he managed to do it, but in the early part of the 20th century, John managed to buy over 300 acres of farmland in Georgia and passed it on to 11 children, divided it equally among 11 children. And Saul's mother, Amanita, was one of John's granddaughters. So Saul is the great-grandson. And my story is really just about how Saul has, spent years of his life, as you said, sort of trying to reclaim all the disparate parts of the 306 acres that he could, that are still sort of owned by people in the extended descendants of John Thomas Jr.
Well, it seems like a rarity to be able to come across land like this and purchase it in this era. Why was it so advantageous for Black Americans to own land if they could in this period after the Civil War?
In the case of John Thomas Jr., what's really interesting is that this wasn't really a story about home ownership. This is a story about land that can be productive. So when the former slaves were emancipated after the Civil War, in this area anyway, in this part of Georgia, for the most part, they continued to be farmers, right? So some of them were sharecroppers. Some of them were able to rent land from white owners and work on that land and then pay the landlord. That's how John started, actually. But it was really mimicking white people who owned land and who therefore had the power dynamic in this economy, in this society, that a lot of the freed slaves wanted to emulate. For John to come up with what is the equivalent of over $107,000 in sort of the early part of the 20th century, and to be able to make that happen, we still don't know how he did it, but it's incredible, however he pulled it off.
Well, Blair's mother on her deathbed begged him not to lose the family's land, as you write in this great piece, Andrea. Why was that such a difficult ask?
Because by the time Amanita passed in the early 2000s, we already knew that at least half of the land had been lost. And lost can mean lots of different things. We use it sort of as a euphemism in the story, but really it means either sort of taken away or lost under some sort of hardship, right? Somebody, we have records that some of this land went for $1, $10, $200 for, huge amounts of land, dozens of acres. Something happened there that, shouldn't have happened. And to this day, there are lots of problems with holding on to what little land they do have still in the family.
In this piece, Andrea, you come back a lot to this term heirs property. Can we just establish what that means and how it applies to Saul's story?
So the way that I think about heirs property is it's any sort of property that passes through generations without clear official ownership documentation. So sometimes we hear the term tangled title. We know, a lot of us have family issues where somebody owned some property, but the grandson had been living there for decades, always thought he was in the will, always thought he stood to to gain the home when the elderly relative died, but that actually wasn't the case. So, tangled title, heirs property, it's something that I think a lot of people are familiar with. Heirs property as an expression tends to be used more formally with Black Americans and also Native Americans, groups who have had a lot of land taken away from them over the years.
I want to hear a little bit more about Saul's experience and story. I mean, how did he backtrack and learn more about this land?
As we said, at the beginning, he was an executive in healthcare. He started off working in a hospital in Los Angeles where he was born and raised. And there was a law firm that was sort of attached to the hospital. And at some point in the 80s, when he would have been, I guess, sort of in his late 30s and really an up and comer, climbing the professional ranks, he asked some members of the law firm to do some pro bono work for him, just sort of trying to figure out what was going on with this land. His mother, as we said, always knew about the land. His mother was still alive at this point, but had always known about the land, always said, her granddaddy had land in Georgia and it was, really important to the family. And so Saul went to this lawyer and said, what can you do for me? And this lawyer did some amazing work. The original plot of 306 acres had been divided into 11 subplots, tracts, plots, whatever you want to call them. And this lawyer was able to actually sort of trace ownership through multiple generations. Again, 1983 or so. So John Thomas had been dead for several decades. We're now on to his grandchildren. But she did this amazing work, sort of backtracking and figuring out who owned what had happened as much as she could. And at that point, 1983, 1984, that's when Saul understood for the first time, like half of I think 6 of the 11 original plots were gone.
So just in terms of his next steps, I mean, what other resources or organizations did Saul tap into?
Saul's been a little bit frustrated with some of the organizations that he reached out to. I hope I made that clear in the story. There's a lot of interest in the heirs property issue right now as a way of sort of, trying to close the racial wealth gap. And there's apparently a lot of money coming from, I guess, philanthropy and nonprofits. But how that actually sort of relates to people on the ground, so to speak, is another question. Saul's really had to go this alone. He had to basically, he set up an LLC to put the land that he personally owns through his mother into the clearest title possible, so there could be no ownership issues. But he has other cousins who are really struggling to clear the title, take ownership, make sure taxes are, back taxes are completely paid off. And it would be great to have like real legal support for that, but they don't have the money for that.
Well, you mentioned his other cousins. I mean, did he bring other family into the fold? This is a story about Saul Blair, but it's also about the Blairs. How do his other family members get involved here?
Yeah, again, unfortunately, I think Saul would say he feels kind of alone. And this is one of the real big questions also about heirs property. Saul feels like, he's done a lot of this all by himself. He has some cousins who are sort of interested. I traveled with him to Georgia earlier in the summer. We had 2 cousins along with us, but he really feels like, this has been his passion, his pet project, and his children just don't care. And none of the younger generation in the extended Benson family is what it is. None of them really seem to care either. When we're talking about land that came down from former slaves, that's just really too bad.
Andrea, this has been a long process for this family. What resolution, if any, did they ultimately reach here?
I actually just talked to Saul just before our conversation today, and he feels like he has come to some sort of resolution. He's been to the land enough that he sort of understands what the land looks like, what is needed from him. And now really the question is, what do we do with it? Like, to honor John, to honor that legacy, to honor, the forefathers who endured slavery, came out the other side, and built a life. What can we do to make the land productive? And for Saul, that's the big question, right? And Saul is a retired, essentially a C-suite executive. And for him to sort of take his stature, to take his buying power, to take his smarts, his connections, and to go to this land in this very, very poor part of Georgia and say, what can we do with it? That could be an economic development tool. It could be a source of, jobs for people who live there. It could be a clinic, that might provide medical supplies or skills training or something. I think that's the big question. How do we make the land not just trees that are growing and, we're having to worry about beetles and, thinning the trees, but how do we make it really, again, honor John's legacy?
All right, Andrea Riquier, excellent journalism on this. Thanks so much for hopping on.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. I'm Taylor Wilson. I'll see you next time.